Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Chairman Dempsey, but first I just want to thank you personally for your lifetime of service, and I hope that you'll take my echo of the request earlier to give our condolences to these heroes that lost their lives last night. In his recent address before Congress, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stated, quote, "So when it comes to Iran and ISIL, the enemy of your enemy is your enemy." Would you respond to that from a military perspective for me?
Well, I won't respond to the Prime Minister's choice of words or how he determines his national interest, but in terms of our national interest, as I mentioned, we've got 6 things that concern us about Iran. One of them happens to be their nuclear program.
Thank you. A follow-up on that is, after 2 wars and 14 years later, as Secretary Carter reminded us early this morning, al-Qaeda still exists. That's not a criticism, it's just a reality. I'd like for you to help me define what we see from a military point of view, what a victory is against with ISIL in this, with regard to this AUMF and our current task ahead of us.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Senator. We actually rarely have the chance to talk about the overall scheme here, if you will. So ISIL is trans-regional, which is to say they're not just confined to Iraq and Syria. They're generational, which is to suggest the duration of this campaign will be prolonged. We are seeking to find a sustainable level of effort. And when I say that, I didn't have the chance to respond to the difference in AUMFs from 1941 to 2015. It's important to note that the use of military force in a state-on-state conflict is very different than the use of military force in a state on a non-state actor. And so the military bring 3 things, and we own 2 lines of effort out of 9 against ISIL. The other lines of effort are governance, counter-messaging, counter-foreign financing, humanitarian relief, and so forth. The 2 things that we're doing is, of course, using direct action, and notably with our airstrikes. And the other is building partner capacity, which is to say, building up the ability of the Peshmerga, the Iraqi security forces, the Sunni tribal leaders to reject ISIL, because it will only be permanently defeated if they reject the ideology, not simply by us cutting off its head. It's actually got to be rejected from within, and that requires a different application of the military instrument than it would be if we were fighting a state-on-state actor. One last thing, and then in the interest of time, I'll stop. The military does 3 things for this nation: direct action, build partners, and enable others. The best example we have right now of enabling others is what we're doing with the French in Mali against al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb. So that's what we're doing. That's what this AUMF allows. And the limiting principle, I sense we're looking, or some of us in the room are looking for a limiting principle. The limiting principle is the way this particular enemy will be defeated. It won't be defeated by U.S. military power alone.
Thank you. You mentioned last week, I think, Mr. Chairman, that you were concerned about what happens afterwards with regard to sectarian violence and so forth. And if we're victorious against ISIL in Iraq, it looks to me like that Iran is also victorious because of their efforts there behind the Shia militia. Can you speak to that just a minute in terms of that part of the definition of victory? And then what do we do from a military standpoint once we declare victory over ISIL in Iraq and Syria, by the way?
There's a lot in that question.
Yes, sir.
Look, Iran is going to be influential in Iraq, has been influential in Iraq. And I am concerned about the way they wield that influence. There's ways they could wield it to promote a better Iraq economically, for example, and there's ways they could wield that influence to create a state where the Sunni and the Kurds are no longer welcome. And it's my concern about the latter that we're watching carefully as this Tikrit event unfolds. As far as declaring victory against ISIL, that's not for us to declare. As I said, very much we can enable it, we can support a coalition, hold the coalition together, we can build into the region, we can harden the region against it militarily, but the ideology has to be defeated by those in the region.
Well, I'm concerned about Iran's stature in the region, particularly relative to Assad and Hezbollah as well as the Shia militia. And so this looks like that if we're successful, we have a partner in crime here where Iran is also going to be successful and strengthen their position. Let me echo one thing that I heard both sides say this morning. I want you to pass this along to your men and women in service, if you will, is that we hope we will end up unified. I absolutely believe we have to be like-minded in this. This is bigger than any partisan position. This is about the security of our country. And the lesson we heard, or the speech from the speech last week, was simply this, and that is, this is bigger than the Middle East. It's bigger than our national security. This is about global security all of a sudden. I'd like to follow up real quick, if I could, on this symmetric versus asymmetric conversation, though. You're talking about the symmetric or the asymmetric question with regard to Iraq, Syria, and the Middle East right now. I'm concerned a little bit, and I'd like to have you respond, if you will, and maybe Secretary Carter as well. What impact does this have on our long-term strategy relative to the symmetric threats? And I know that we don't talk a lot about People's Republic of China. We don't talk about Russia in this conversation, but it's all interrelated. And I'd like to see how this, in your mind, relates to the longer-term strategy.
Thanks, Senator. So for the first time in my 40 years, we have both state and non-state threats to our national interest. Because in my first 25 years, it was all about state threats, notably the Soviet Union. For the last 15 years, it's all about non-state actors. We live now in an environment where we have threats to both, they're emanating from both states and non-states. And it makes, we're actually adapting quite well to that. And I don't want to turn this into a budget hearing, but if we don't get some budget help on this issue of sequestration, it's going to be very difficult to manage both threats.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.